The first time I heard about the Lutterloh pattern making system, I was intrigued. It was this video from Cornelius Choir, and now I've tried it out myself, and I have thoughts. So many thoughts. Got a second? Is it really a speedy shortcut to pattern making, or does it seem more magical than it is? How much experience do you need? And are the patterns any good? Hi there, welcome back, or if you're new here, my name is Marlies and I'm a pattern and apparel designer. I used to work in the fashion tech niche, mostly education and digitalization for big fashion brands, and I'm currently self-employed. I'm back to doing a lot of pattern making while developing my own sewing patterns, and I share videos about my own creative projects, often from a rather technical or sustainable perspective. And from that technical perspective, I want to share my honest review of the Lutterloh system today. I plotted one of their patterns, made the necessary adjustments, and sewed a mock-up so I could really test the full workflow from start to finish. But this is not a review of this specific pattern. I noticed that most videos about Lutterloh seem to focus on reviewing the pattern that they made, which is of course very relevant, but what I was missing from those reviews was a critical look at the system as a whole, and most importantly, which type of person would love it and who might not. So in this video, I'll be sharing my experience as someone who is academically trained in pattern making, but I'll mostly try to focus on putting everything into perspective. How it compares to drafting your own patterns or with commercial sewing patterns, which skills you are expected to have, and again, which type of person would benefit the most from this system. So if you are curious whether Lutterloh is worth it for your sewing practice, this video is for you. Full transparency, this is not a sponsored video, but I did receive the kit for free from their Dutch-Belgian reseller. I'm under no obligation to make this video, I'm not being paid to do so, and all opinions are completely my own. And if you watch until the end, you will see that this is definitely not gonna be a one-sided, purely positive vibes promotional video, because I really wanted to love it. And in some ways I do, but in others, let's talk about it. I want to start off here, on their own website, because they make two pretty big claims right when you open their homepage. This is the first one, pattern making in minutes. And this is arguably an even bigger claim, but not the one I wanted to talk about in this video. I meant this line right below. Dressmaking made easier. These two claims tell me a lot about how they see themselves and who they think their system is for. Lutterloh positions itself as a pattern making system, but not necessarily as a pattern brand or a direct competitor to commercial sewing patterns like the Big Four, Burda, or indie pattern designers. So instead of comparing them to finished sewing patterns from those guys, let's compare them to what they are positioning themselves against. Self-drafting. That first claim is about time investment. Pattern making in minutes. And this one is actually pretty straightforward. Yes, Lutterloh is generally faster than drafting a pattern from scratch. One small caveat though, because self-drafting doesn't always mean start from zero. Most commonly, you work with basic blocks, which means you draft it once, you refine the fit until it's perfect, and then you use it over and over again. So in my case, working with a block that I know well, that I know fits well, might actually be much faster than working with Lutterloh, because I know what I'm working with and I don't need to figure out the pattern anymore. The fit, the amount of ease, garment measurements, some of the things that I was missing from their patterns. More on that later. Time investment, of course, depends on a lot of different variables. Your experience, skill level, the type of garment, lots of ifs and buts. But there's another one. If we average it out for the average person, I would agree that Lutterloh is probably faster than drafting your own pattern. Claim number 2, dressmaking made easier. So now let's talk about difficulty. And for this part, I want to focus on the complexity of the system itself, not the complexity of the garment. A tailor blazer is always slightly more complex than a circle skirt, no matter what system you use. With system complexity, I mean things like how easy is the method to understand, how many steps it takes, how much experience it assumes, and how guided or unguided the process is. And with that in mind, yes, the Lutterloh system is easier than self-drafting. And this is especially true if you are new to both. I came in from a very different angle with different expectations and assumptions. But if you're new to both, it's a completely different story. On average, Lutterloh is probably easier than self-drafting, as it has a much lower barrier for entry. So it is a speedy shortcut to pattern drafting? You tell me, this is how it works. First, you need one of their starting kits. What exactly comes in these kits depends on where you live. Different resellers seem to include slightly different tools, but the essentials are always the same. The star of the show is this measuring tape. Looks like a normal measuring tape at first, but it's not. One end contains Lutterloh's own scaling system, and the rest is a regular metric measuring tape. It actually reminds me of these traditional Taylor scale rulers, but kind of in reverse. Instead of drafting tiny patterns at half scale or quarter scale based on full-size measurements, you're actually starting with the miniature pattern and scaling it up to full size. The numbers in the white section correspond to body measurements, and you only need to take 2 measurements of your own body, your bust and your hip, for every single one of their patterns. That is the whole idea behind their golden rule. And yes, they really do mean the golden rule as in the golden ratio. Fibonacci spiral, Leonardo da Vinci's perfect body proportions. I don't really buy into that perfect proportions narrative, to be honest. Beauty is extremely subjective. It's culturally influenced, and there isn't even a definitive consensus on what is most appealing. And there shouldn't be. So that threw me off a little, but in all fairness, every pattern making system is built on a set of average assumptions. Even the methods that we use to draft basic blocks assume certain things. Think of cup size, shoulder slope, length proportions, etc. The most important takeaway is that there is no pattern system that will fit every single type of body straight out of the box. Not commercial sewing patterns, not self-drafting, and also not Lutterloh. Some adjustment is normal, and honestly, to be expected. Back to the system. The kit also comes with some rulers, I think cardboard by default, and some kits may also come with these bigger solid plastic rulers. But honestly, if you already have any French or tailoring curves at home, then those are also completely fine. The booklet itself comes in a bunch of languages. Mine is in Dutch, so make sure that you order from a local reseller to make sure that you get the language you need. The patterns come on small pages like this, with tiny diagrams and numbered points around the edges. You find your measurement, place the pin, and then you pin it to the middle of this cross to create a pivot point. Then align the tape with one of these short lines, and at the distance indicated by this number, you mark a dot. Rinse and repeat, and then you connect the dots. That's it. You now have a full-size pattern piece based on your bust or hip measurement. And that's how you can draft any of their patterns. They have hundreds of options. Most of the default starter kits I saw seem to come with 280 patterns in their standard size range, which goes up until a maximum bust or hip circumference of 140 centimeters. They also offer a separate kit for larger sizes, which includes a blue ruler, and that one starts at 110 and goes up until 170 centimeters in circumference, which I was happy to see. And then they also sell individual booklets with just the patterns, which they call supplements, for if you want more designs. Something that works really well is how little space this takes up. This tiny binder can hold hundreds of patterns, which would normally take up way more space if they were printed at full size. Of course, it doesn't beat the convenience and space-saving aspects of digital PDF patterns, but for physical patterns, this is impressively compact. So that is Lutterloh in a nutshell. Tiny blueprints, a special measuring tape, 2 body measurements, connect the dots. Sounds so straightforward. But the real question is, how does it feel in practice? Time to try it out. For my kit, I actually asked for their men's edition because I'm not someone who wears a lot of very girly dresses and skirts, and I already have way more basic blocks that fit my body than that I have menswear patterns to make things for my partner. So this is the supplement that I got in my kit, which includes 50 menswear patterns. Let's chat about picking a pattern and plotting those dots while I finish up sewing the last steps of the shirt. I've been wanting to make my partner a new shirt again for a while now. Something relaxed, kind of summery, in a nice linen. But first a wearable toile in a nice cotton shirting. So the men's supplement included 2 shirt patterns, and that's honestly where I already ran into my first unexpected challenge before I even touched that tape measure. When choosing a pattern from the booklet, you only get 1 fashion illustration and a text sketch. Just one, only the back. There is no technical drawing of the front, there are no construction details, no photos to see the fit of the garment on a human body. So even between those 2 shirts in the booklet, it was hard to tell the differences. This one has a yoke, this one doesn't. The shapes of the collar are slightly different, and the sleeve head seems to be slightly taller in this shirt. And this squiggle seems to indicate a slightly more relaxed fit than no squiggle. It honestly felt a bit like a guessing game here, because you're not really getting many clues to make an informed decision here. Whenever I'm working with a commercial sewing pattern, the first thing I look for are the charts. Especially the finished measurement chart gives you so much information about the intended amount of ease. But you don't get any of those here. No ease info, no size chart, not even a small note to kind of describe the fit of the garment. Relaxed fit, slim fitting, just give me anything. But no. So it's all very minimal, and to be fair, it's also part of the charm of that kind of safe spacing space-saving concept that we talked about earlier. Maybe I also just went in with the wrong mindset, expecting that mindless kind of sewing from working with a finished commercial sewing pattern, instead of getting more of like a empty canvas to customize to your liking. But yeah, personally, I just really missed all of those clues and little bits of info to understand and know upfront what I was committing myself to. I ended up going for the black shirt, the NN5, which was honestly purely based on the fact that it had a yoke. No other reason than that, because I still had no clue about the amount of ease that both of those shirts had. When placing the dots, I put my partner's chest measurement, but then also one size up and one size down. So that way I could measure the amount of ease after connecting all the dots and the shapes, and easily still go one size up or down, depending on whether I wanted more or less ease. When it comes to the point of actually placing those dots, that was so fun. You just kind of point the tape, you mark the spot, you point it again, mark another spot. That was that mindless drafting that I was looking for. You genuinely don't have to think at all during this part, which I instantly proved by forgetting to actually switch my pin from the chest to the hip measurement when I moved below the waist. All dots above the waist are intended to be placed based on the chest measurement, and the dots below the waist are placed based on the hip measurement. I caught my mistake not too much later and fixed it, but that's also when I started noticing my first concerns with the workflow. One of them is precision. The tape measure has quite a lot of wiggle room, so it's very easy to just be like half a centimeter off to left or right. I also noticed that mine had like the slightest bend between like where the stiff area is connected to the like flexible yellow part of the tape measure, which obviously didn't help either. So to place my dots as precisely as possible, I placed a long ruler against that stiff white part of the Lutterloh measuring tape, so I could first draw a straight guideline at the correct angle. Then I went back to the Lutterloh measuring tape and marked my dots along this line. Now, I'm aware that I'm someone who drafts with millimeter precision, and not everyone does, not everyone cares. At the academy where I studied, even normal pencils were frowned upon. The golden standard, see what I did there, was a mechanical 0.5 millimeter pencil, and that's just drilled into me, and I still like to work that way, even to this day. Speaking of the physical components of their kit, I really like the thickness of their rulers. The edge being both thick and completely straight, no rounded edges, makes them really nice to work with. But I wasn't really convinced by the curves of their rulers. I constantly struggled to get the curve to look the way I wanted, and to cross through all the dots I had to connect when using these curves. In the end, I grabbed my own French rulers to refine a few lines. The second thing that really stood out to me was kind of a surprise actually, because when you plot those dots to create your full-size pattern piece, it doesn't always end up centered or oriented the same way as the miniature piece in the middle. They can also rotate, and with rotating I mean that things like the grain line or the center front, they don't always automatically end up parallel with where they are on the paper pattern sheet. So that is something to pay attention to, but also something that I have more thoughts on, more on that later. Because one more thing that I want to mention first is it also means that you can't just plop down your paper and start tracing. Well, you can, of course, but I didn't feel like wasting a bunch of papers, so I tried to plan ahead. Lutterloh recommends copying the page, so you can then cut up all the pattern pieces and tape them to the full-size pattern piece that you're tracing. But I don't have a printer at home, so I decided to just use the real sheet and treat it very carefully. The way I did it is I taped the sheet to my cutting mat, and then I put semi-transparent pattern paper on top so I could trace it. And that actually worked really well. I kept moving the sheet around so I could check where the edges were going to land before taping down my big piece of paper. And that way I could just make sure that I would end up with my pattern piece somewhere in the corner of the paper instead of right in the middle and have a lot of paper waste. Here you can see the outline of the pattern piece and the rectangular outline of the page itself, which both show how rotated and tilted the drafted pattern piece ended up compared to its tiny little version in the middle. Nothing about this is wrong, of course, it's just how the system works, but it does relate to another concern that I ran into. Because up until now, the system felt simple, accessible, felt super quick. But once I saw those dots translated into actual shapes, that's when things were starting to feel a little bit off. because the pattern pieces didn't just look rotated, they looked askew. The center front, for example, wasn't straight. Angles between the center front and the neckline, as well as the center front and the hemline, were nowhere near 90 degrees, which is what you would normally expect for the center front line. The whole thing just looked a bit slanted and skewed. Now technically, I do understand why this happens. The pivot point sits in the middle of the pattern, and the angle of the center front is determined by this corner point and that corner point. But these 2 points are not based on the same body measurement. The top corner uses the bust or chest circumference, and the bottom corner uses the hip circumference. That is what makes the system so flexible and allows it to accommodate for different ratios between the chest and hip measurements. But it also means there's no way the system can guarantee a 90-degree angle for edges like the center front. Only way in which this edge can end up perfectly straight, no matter which chest to hip ratio you are drafting, is if the pivot point would have been exactly on that center front line. I'm assuming that wasn't possible for other reasons, because with a system as complex as this, I'm sure they've considered all of the options. But it does annoy me that the angles were so off, because I'm not talking about just 1 or maybe 2 degrees. These corners were about 5 degrees off, and in my opinion, that's a bit too much. But the main thing that bothered me about this is that there is no guidance. No note, no acknowledgement, nothing to warn you that this could happen. A simple, hey, this can happen, this is how we recommend fixing it, would already go a long way here. Because you're not only expected to fix it on your own, first you need to spot it. And if you don't have a lot of drafting experience yet, you might not always notice things like this. And the reason I would like them to tell me how to do it is because there are multiple ways to do so. And the way that you change it for a big change like this, it affects the grain line, the shoulder slope, basically the entire balance of the garment. I didn't doubt my ability to fix it. I would figure out a way to make it work, but I doubted the pattern. And actually, in that video I mentioned earlier from Cornelius Quiring, I also thought that I noticed this exact issue. He didn't address it in the video, so maybe he also just fixed it on his own. But it does make me wonder if it's maybe not a one-off isolated issue that only happened in the pattern that I made. What I ended up doing was comparing the shoulder slope to a men's shirt pattern that I've drafted myself and that I've used many times before, one that I know fits my partner well. I straightened out the center front based on that angle, which worked fine for me, but it does require you to have something to compare it to. And if you don't, I think that brings us back to the guessing game again. I also noticed that their pattern legend does include a symbol for 90-degree corners, but it only appeared once in the miniature diagrams of this shirt, even though there were several corners that should have been squared. The next thing that stood out to me was the lack of notches, especially on the sleeve. There was one notch at the top of the sleeve head, but no notches along the front or back curve. Not on the sleeve, but also not on the armholes. There is a small V that indicates the front, but without notches, it's much harder to check your seams, measure ease, distribute it correctly, and just sew the sleeve accurately. I also found out later through a YouTube tutorial from that Dutch and Belgian reseller, so not from Lutterloh's own instructions, that this tiny little line pointing inward from a dot actually indicates a notch, like here at the top of the sleeve. But that symbol is not included in the legend. Would have been helpful. So again, it's not unusable, but it's inconsistent. And that's what matters, especially if you're a beginner. Another example in which the system kind of assumes that you already know what you're doing is that there's no cutting list. No overview of all the pieces you need to make your garment. Instead of a pattern piece inventory list per garment, they do list the pattern piece names in the legend. Over here, all the names are standardized, which is kind of cool. One list of names applicable for every pattern piece and every single garment you can imagine. But that's also how you end up with rather ambiguous names like sleeve, loose part. Do you mind if I just keep calling that a sleeve placket? And that sleeve placket also deserves some attention, by the way. Uniform and rectangular pieces like the cuffs, sleeve placket or the pocket are given in dimensions to draft yourself instead of through plotting those dots like the other pattern pieces. Which makes total sense as long as those dimensions are clear and you already know how those pattern pieces work. For the sleeve placket, you only get 2 dimensions. But this shape is what a sleeve placket looks like after it is sewn. This shape does not depict the pattern piece that you need to cut to create a sleeve placket like this. This is what the pattern looks like for a 1-piece sleeve placket or a 2-piece sleeve placket. So again, you either already know how to draft and sew a sleeve placket, or you're off to Google. I feel like a cutting list would really help to provide a little bit of extra guidance and clarity. Because the cutting info is also kind of inconsistent, I'm guessing they consider it common knowledge that you need to cut the front, back, sleeve and collar pieces twice to make a shirt. but that you do need a reminder to also cut the cuff, sleeve placket and pocket twice, even though the cuff should actually be cut 4 times. I think you get the point. I was a bit bothered by all these little inconsistencies and imperfections. Individually, they're not the end of the world. They won't be the single cause of any extreme fit issues. But everything combined, they can definitely lead to some annoying fit issues or just cause a lot of frustration, trial and error in the process. And it just doesn't really give me the impression that the system is built on high precision. What did I end up changing? To give you a fair review of the fit of this shirt, I tried to change as little as possible. So I only fixed what felt like genuine red flags, the things that would turn it into an unwearable twelve. The biggest one was that I deepened the armholes by almost 3 centimeters because it looked extremely short, which I double checked by laying that same shirt pattern that I know and trust on top of it again. I also adjusted that on the sleeve head, of course, to make sure that they would still fit each other, and I added the sleeve notches. And as I mentioned before, I also squared off the center front, did the same in the center back, and I also added a pleat in the back and a few extra details that I wanted in my shirt, which were that I made the hemline a little bit less curved than it originally was. I added a little seam in the collar tips so I could play with the stripes. And I also turned my sleeve placket into a 3-piece sleeve placket so I could do some stripe play there. Oh, and I did the inseam buttonhole placket, which I really love the results. And I also fixed the shoulder seam lengths. They were more than 1 centimeter off and not in the way where it made any sense. Because if you ever notice the back being longer than the front, that might be intentional. The difference is then supposed to be eased in while sewing, which creates some extra room for the roundness of your shoulders in the back. But on this pattern, the front came out much longer than the back, which didn't really make sense to me or seem intentional, so I fixed that. And at the end, I trued everything, of course, and added my own seam allowances. Nothing advanced or unconventional, but it does require some prior knowledge of pattern drafting or basic adjustments. This video is already becoming awfully long, so I'll spare you the details. But if anyone would like me to make another video specifically about truing and things I would recommend to check in your pattern pieces, let me know in the comments. And I think this is a good moment to talk about pattern readiness and go back to that matrix from the start of this video. Because while plotting the dots is quick and easy, it results in a draft, not in a ready-to-sew pattern. You still need to check the balance, maybe add some notches, true corners, curves, seam lengths, maybe add your own details for construction, add seam allowance. If you've ever sewn a Burda pattern, you may already be familiar with adding your own seam allowance. Patterns that come without seam allowance definitely have their own benefits. If you regularly make a lot of pattern adjustments, you may even prefer working without seam allowance. I do, but as far as I know, most people who sew their own garments at home prefer patterns where the seam allowance is already included. It simply makes the pattern more ready to sew. One more thing I want to call out explicitly, because this really affects expectations. There are no step-by-step instructions for these patterns. 0. The booklet includes a couple of pages with some general sewing techniques, but nothing walks you through sewing those garments step by step. So from drafting to sewing, you are expected to already know or be able to figure out the vast majority of the workflow. So if we expand our matrix that's currently focused on pattern making systems, with these 3 examples of commercial sewing pattern brands, we see an interesting shift. I'm briefly going to move Lutterloh out of the grid so we can first have a look at these 3. On average, I would consider the group of indie pattern brands to probably be the easiest and fastest option of all. Simplicity represents all of the big 4 pattern brands here, and their patterns may include a little bit less hand-holding than the average indie pattern, but it's still high up in the fast and easy corner. And the reason I'm calling out Burda on its own here is because their patterns also require a little bit of extra work compared to these guys. Their patterns also come without seam allowance, and they come on big pattern sheets with all pattern pieces layered across each other, which is why I would place them a little bit lower than these 2. Self-drafting probably stays in the opposite corner when it comes to time investment and difficulty. And Lutterloh, compared to these 3 options, they start drifting a bit further away from that fast and easy corner, ending up much closer to the middle. Makes sense, right? We're now comparing pattern making systems with brands that publish finished sewing patterns. Obviously, these are going to be faster and easier than drafting your own. But I think it's an important comparison to make, because I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with at least one of these 3 examples, if not all. So all of this puts that topic of pattern readiness into perspective and helps us answer the question, who is this system for? But before we get into that question, I quickly want to show you the final result. Because after all of that drafting, adjustment, the final test is the fit. And I think these are the fanciest finishes I've ever done on a wearable toile. Everything is finished with extra narrow flat felt seams or French seams. And I had a lot of fun playing around with stripe orientation on the collar, sleeve plackets, front button placket and the pocket. But before I committed to all of those fancy details, I had actually already done a quick test fit. I basted the main pieces together by hand to review the overall fit, which seemed wearable, so then I felt confident to let my inner perfectionist have fun with those stripes. And the final fit, very wearable. I think we're both pretty happy with the results. His shoulders feel a little bit narrow, but that doesn't really surprise me because he has pretty broad shoulders in comparison to the rest of his torso. If I were to use this pattern again, I'd want a little bit more width here, and I would also add a little bit more room here in the back yoke to increase that across shoulder measurement, because he has enough room here because of the pleat, but the back yoke feels a little bit tight. I would also change the shapes of the collar and the collar stand a little bit. The collar tips feel a little bit too wide, as in they don't wrap far enough to the front in my opinion, but that's more of a design choice of course. And I would also increase the overall neckline circumference because there's no closing this top button without choking at the moment, purely for decoration. In the pattern, I didn't touch the body length at all. It seemed a bit long, but I just cut it as it was. And in the end, before hemming, I shortened it by 5 centimeters because it was indeed too long. The silhouette is pretty close to what I expected after I had measured the ease and I had added the back pleat for that relaxed fit. And I'm really glad that I adjusted the armhole. The underarm saddle seems to sit pretty accurately and comfortably right now. But honestly, I don't think it would have fit at all without that armhole adjustment, which confirms something important. The final fit depends heavily on the decisions and adjustments you make after plotting. If I had skipped those adjustments or didn't know how to make them, this could have been a very different outcome. And that brings us to the final question. Who thrives with this kind of freedom? And who might find it more frustrating than empowering? After everything I shared, I think it's quite clear that it's not only a question about skill level. Equally, or arguably maybe even more important, is how you like to work. How much precision you expect, how much guidance you want, how much guidance you need, and how comfortable you are filling in the gaps yourself. And it's not just about speed and difficulty anymore. I think the overarching topics are maybe more about mentality and guidance. Striving for perfection versus it's good enough, and independence versus please tell me what to do. Which is how I ended up outlining 4 different types of sewists or makers. And these aren't fixed personality types. Most of us move between them, depending on the day, the mood, the project. But when it comes to pattern making, you might recognize yourself in one of these. Let's start with the first one. The perfectionist is the sewist who values accuracy, systems, and consistency above everything else. You want patterns to be technically complete. You expect instructions, and you want them to remove uncertainty, not introduce it. You want to enjoy sewing. The only things you want to worry about are beautiful finishes and impeccable stitching. Not about mistakes or missing details in the pattern. You care about peaceful sewing and immaculate results. If you are someone like this, who strives for perfection, and you would like to be told what to do, Lutterloh might feel frustrating to you, because the system leaves a lot of decisions open. And that perfect outcome you are looking for highly depends on how much you are willing to figure out yourself. So it might not feel like much of a shortcut to you, maybe more like extra work. But next up, we have the system hacker. Also a perfectionist, but with a very different attitude. They enjoy figuring things out on their own. They want to do their own thing and don't like being told what to do. They thrive when they're given a rough framework because they don't want rigid instructions. They love experimenting throughout the process and they're always trying to improve themselves to get those perfect results. If you're this type of person, Lutterloh could work for you, as long as you set your expectations for the system to be a starting point, not a flawless finished thing. And I think within this group of people, skill level can introduce some interesting twists. For these system hackers, if you have a bit of pattern making experience, you can absolutely create some wonderful things with the Lutterloh system. But if you have a lot of experience though, it might feel a bit more tedious and less controllable than what you are used to. That's how I felt. But also if you don't have much experience, it might just feel very overwhelming because you have the vision and you may see what's wrong, but you don't have the tools yet to achieve the quality that you're aiming for. All of this is of course very different from person to person, but I hope this little analysis helps to give you some insight into whether the system system would or would not fit into your workflow. Now over to the weekend sewist. This is the kind of person that sews for fun, who appreciates clear instructions, predictability, and a realistic, achievable process. You don't want to be debugging patterns, you want to follow them. And you just want things to work. You don't have time to spend hours troubleshooting. You value process over perfection. You don't obsess over tiny little details like those previous two do. You sew to relax and unwind, to enjoy the process, and to explore making things with your own hands. That's not to say you don't like a challenge, but you prefer to do that with clear steps and solid guidance. For this group of makers, Lutterloh could work for garments that you're maybe already somewhat familiar with, but for anything new or more challenging than you've done before, the lack of guidance may feel stressful. If you prefer clarity over creative ambiguity, you want to just switch off your brain and follow the steps to enjoy the process, Lutterloh might not be the best fit for you. But last but not least, we have the improv maker. This is the ultimate vibes-based sewist who treats patterns as suggestions, who's guided more by feel than by measurements, and who's comfortable with approximation. If it looks right, it is right. The only thing you follow religiously is your own intuition, not pattern's instructions. Missing information in the pattern means more creative freedom. Just like the system hacker, you love experimentation, but you do not fuss over those tiny little details that no one is ever gonna see anyways. And honestly, I think this is where Lutterloh shines. For the improv maker, flexibility feels empowering. If you enjoy figuring things out as you go, adjusting intuitively, and you always make any pattern your own anyways, Lutterloh can be a really fun and efficient tool. But as I said before, most of us are actually a mix of these, and depending on the project, we might move between them. And just to be clear, there's absolutely no right or wrong mindset here. In the end, we're just sewing clothes. And for most of us, it's a hobby, and hobbies should be fun. Just do what feels good to you. No rules. And for me personally, I'd say I'm probably a system hacker. If you couldn't tell yet, I am that person that obsesses over the tiniest little details. Can't help it. And I can also be stubborn, and I love figuring things out on my own and coming up with new solutions. On the days where I want to switch off my brain, I take a step sideways and I become the perfectionist. And when I really want to let go of everything and just create, I become the improv maker. I guess I have yet to find the weekend sewist in me. Okay, enough about me. If we go back to our original matrix now, I think the middle is a pretty good spot for Lutterloh, especially compared to these guys. And those two claims from their website, after everything we discussed, agree or disagree? Compared to self-drafting? Yes. Compared to these guys? Maybe not. But whether that's a good or a bad thing, that's completely up to you. People who value speed, flexibility, and creative freedom will probably find most value in the Lutterloh system. Those who don't mind doing their own adjustments and figuring things out as they go. On the contrary, people who rely heavily on clear instructions, those who expect complete patterns out of the box, and for whom sewing without any guidance feels more stressful than empowering, may not enjoy Lutterloh that much. So what is my final verdict? Will I be using Lutterloh again in the future? Possibly. Depends on the project. I'm glad I tried it and I learned a lot from it. But overall, to me, it just didn't feel like that magical shortcut it's often made out to be. Whenever I have the choice between working for my Lutterloh pattern or one of my own self-drafted blocks, I will probably always go for the latter. But if I ever want to make something specific that I don't have a suitable self-drafted block for yet, and there is a Lutterloh pattern that matches that type of garment, yeah, I could see myself giving it another chance. Who knows? After a lot of reflections while working on this video, I also realized I had very different expectations from what it is and what it intends to be. So that is on me and why I wanted to make this video. I hope that everything I shared in this video may have helped some of you to get a better understanding of the system and set your expectations correctly, so you can make an informed decision before you invest in one of their kits. Now, I would of course love to know if you can recognize yourself in any of those 4 types of sewists I described in this video, or maybe you can't relate at all. Please let me know in the comments. And of course, if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them all in the comments below, if there's still anything left that I haven't touched upon in this awfully long video. And if any of you have tried Lutterloh yourself, I would love to hear your thoughts. Whether you agree with the things that I shared, or if there's anything else that you noticed that I forgot to mention in this video, please let me know. If you watched all the way until here, thank you so much for watching. I want to send you the best wishes for the upcoming holidays, and I hope to see you soon. Hope you enjoyed it.